So that's the credo, of course, coming out of a Christian perspective, that was trying to encourage people to see, as Rastafari might say, one love. That's beautiful, and it's something that we should all aspire to, and it's something that I myself aspired to, even as a young boy growing up. But what I also came to understand by talking to my Uncle Johnny, who was a bit of a nationalist and came out of Moorish science, was that charity begins at home. So essentially, you must love humanity, but that love for humanity must begin first with your love of self. Well, it was very hard to have a considerable love of self growing up in an environment where you really weren't exposed to too much that had to do with the African world or Asiatic experience. I grew up in New York State. It was not Mississippi, of course, which for those who know anything about American history, that's saying something, right? Meaning that it was not an environment that was blatantly racist, for the most part. But it was an environment that wasn't teaching much about the history of African peoples. And if it did, it would always present African peoples as a group that were either slaves or struggling for civil rights. There was nothing else discussed. There was no context in terms of, well, what were African peoples doing prior to slavery, prior to the civil rights movement and Dr. King. Dr. King is vital. He's important for understanding U.S. history and world history. Malcolm X is also vital for understanding U.S. history and world history. But why was there no reference to the legacy of African people in Western history that didn't involve Africans as slaves, but involved Africans as masters, involved Africans as engineers, involved Africans as teachers, involved Africans as merchants, and everything in between? That legacy was not something that was absent in Western history. It was something that was deliberately avoided. This is something that I would hear from my Uncle Johnny, who was a bit of a radical, and I actually write about him a little bit in the opening chapter, or introduction to my book. Uncle Johnny would always try to get even my own family members. I don't know about folks here, you may be able to relate to what I'm saying. We can be born of the same mother and father, and yet we're not exactly like our siblings. Some siblings take to what is being taught, others, man, I don't know what that's, I don't want to hear that stuff. It's either too radical or they ain't got time for it. I was one who listened, and I looked for the truth, and it's what actually inspired me to be a historian. So when my Uncle Johnny would talk about the Moors, and we'd be speaking with neighbors who were next door, and he would say, the Moors are responsible for initiating what we know as the scientific, or as he said, the Renaissance. He just said the Renaissance. The Renaissance in Europe. I'm probably 14 years old, maybe 13 when I first heard that. I'm thinking it's just my Uncle Johnny just talking again, He felt he was feeling empowered that day and said something that didn't have any validity. And then I happened to be watching a movie called The Long Ships, which was made in the late 50s or it was the early 60s. Anyone here seen, there's a film called The Long Ships?
Yeah.
Richard Widmark and Sidney Poitier played a Moor in this film. And just to show you how someone said earlier, there are no happenings, law governs all events, and this is coming out of Moorish teachings. I knew this was no accident. That shortly after my uncle would talk about this idea of Moors, and I'm going, yeah, it's just so much background noise. I then see a movie with Sidney Poitier that showed this obviously dark olive complexion. Later I would learn famous, was the way I grew up. Later I would understand how famous an actor Sidney Poitier was. In fact, I was younger than 14. I must have been about 12. And I watched this and I said, okay, now this has raised some questions. What are quote unquote black people? And notice I said quote unquote, and I'll get to that later. What are quote unquote black people doing as rulers and scientists, as were portrayed aspects of that film. And yet, I don't know anything about this from the public education that I was exposed to. Then I read a book by J.A. Rogers that was given to me when I was 16 called From Superman to Man. Joel Augustus Rogers was a Jamaican self-taught historian born in Negril, who actually wrote this book called From Superman to Man, which was about racism and how it was formulated as a result of a lack of historical knowledge. So what Rogers was trying to get people to understand was that people of European ancestry are, this is J.E. Rogers' perspective, your brothers, your sisters. They are not your superiors. That's an important point to make when he was writing in the early 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Because most people of African ancestry, and even people of Asian ancestry, seem to assume, if they especially were raised in the West, that there was this inherent superiority of being European, and this inherent inferiority of being African or Asiatic or Asian. That's not going to make for a of one blood, God made all peoples of the earth mindset. If you've already believed that you are born inherently inferior or inherently superior, neither should apply. But the curriculum that most of us were exposed to were doing just that. I remember, I don't know if anyone here has seen the movie Dragon, about the life of Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee, as a Chinese man growing up, he grew up first in Hong Kong, and he comes to San Francisco and Oakland. He made the point that people were treating him as a caricature from the old Charlie Chan movies. And he said, no one understands really the beauty of Chinese culture or who we are as Chinese people. And I want to show that. And he did it through martial arts and film. He didn't hate Europeans. It had nothing to do with hatred. It had to, of a people. It had to do with hatred of a value system that was put in place, and Europeans were the victims of it, as were other people. You can only hold people responsible for what they know. You can't hold them responsible for what they don't know. These are the sorts of things that I began to think as I was growing up, and my uncle is this major influence, and I said, you know what? Like Gandhi said, you need to be the change that you want. If you want to change, you have to start to initiate that. Now, what makes this even more interesting, perhaps for me, is my name is Jose Pimienta, which is a Spanish-Portuguese name. My father was born in Cuba. My mother's family, essentially, they were British subjects. They were from Barbados and Bermuda, primarily. And then there were others who came from Wales, Ireland, and, as I would learn later, one of them was actually from Fez, Morocco. And I only found that out probably in probably it was the early 90s, when one of my aunts had said, you know, this the one who was from Bermuda, and she said, you know, actually we had a family member on your this is a Bermudian accent, everyone knows Bermuda accent, on your mother's side, who was from Dockyard. Dockyard is an area of Bermuda. And this person had evidently come and was working for the British Merchant Marine. I didn't know that. My uncle didn't know that. Again, there are no happenings. Law governs all events. So this information, so what do I do with that? I have family who are clearly African, because then the Cuban side were people of African and Asiatic ancestry. Cuba had a lot of people who were Yoruba in terms of ethnic groups, and people from the Congo as well. Then I had people from Wales and Ireland and Native Americans as well. I said, how do we address this? Right? How do we look at this? As I started to study Moorish history, and I started to understand the concept of what Moor, people often talk about how confusing, well, what is a Moor? You know, it's such a broad term. If you look up the origin of the word, sometimes the term refers to people whose ancestors are African. Other times they say it was just a reference to anybody who was dark in complexion. Then you'll find more specific references to people who are said to be linked to the land of Moab, which is today the country of Jordan. Then you see other people say that it was used as a reference to Native Americans. Well, how can it be all those people? Isn't it just another word for black? Well, the answer is no. And the reason is because black has too much baggage attached to it in terms of the law. So if we go back and understand the law, in terms of how, and it was noted earlier about us living in a republic, right, in terms of the United States. The United States is a democratic republic. Rome was a republic. What could you be if you lived in Rome? What would your status have been? You could have been a Roman citizen. You could have been a Roman resident or alien resident, which meant you were not a citizen. Or you could have been a Roman slave. If you're not a citizen, you're a resident. If you weren't a citizen, you didn't have the rights of the citizenry, right? If you were an alien who were waiting to become a citizen, then you weren't a slave, but you still didn't have the rights of a citizen. It's the same thing in US history. What my uncle would talk about, in addition to just these basic aspects of knowing our history, was also knowing aspects of our historical connection to the United States. And I know Canada is a different situation, obviously, because of different history. And how to navigate that is something that we can talk about. But the United States as a democratic republic, different situation. So what I decided to do after I finished my undergraduate in history, and my undergraduate was really focusing more on Civil War history and aspects of Reconstruction, I decided for my master's thesis in history that I wanted to focus on the Moors, because my uncle had convinced me that there was something there. Now mind you, the only information I'm getting about the Moors is essentially from my uncle, who's a member of the Moorish Science Temple. I wasn't even a member initially. I was just listening to him, and then I would say, okay, let me check that out. So I went off to college, and then I said, wait, what he said was true. Then I started meeting people from Europe, from Italy, and Portugal, and Turkey, who were telling me the things that my uncle was saying were true. And I said, my uncle didn't have a college degree. But this was someone who was attentive. This is someone who was interested in seeking knowledge. We talk about the ancient Greek notion of know thyself, which of course they say that the Romans borrowed, right? But the origin even of know thyself originates in the Nile Valley. That's a Kemetic belief. Know thyself. Study yourself first. In studying yourself, you begin to know the world, you begin to know others, and you begin to know God. Now that may sound blasphemous in some people's minds, that how can you study yourself and know God? Well, again, we can have that discussion later about the differences in religion. As fate would have it, I ended up being asked to teach a history of Christianity class, and I didn't want to teach it, but I got a free trip to Egypt, Jordan, and Israel, so I took it. But as, again, fate would have it, that experience would allow me then to learn more about the different schools of thought in Christian communities. Groups like the Ebionites and the Adoptionists and the Gnostics, right? All of these communities that were basically giving a different understanding of the teachings of Jesus the Christ that, amazingly enough, turned out to look a lot like Moorish science. So that's a kind of general overview, and then what will help me stay on cue, because I can start to wander into different areas because there's so much information I want to present, and that's why I have a PowerPoint so I can stay focused. But I then went on to finish a doctorate at Temple University after I did a master's on Moorish Spain and the rise of the university system. Some of you may be familiar with Dr. Ivan van Sertima, the late, great Dr. Ivan van Sertima. Yes, one of our assets.